Hey guys, today we'll be learning about the different force field objects and practical ways to use each one. Let's get started.
First up, we have curve guide forces. This force relies on the shape of a curved object and uses different fields to move the fluid. By default, the attraction strength is enabled with a value equal to the default gravity of -9.81. Let's see what this looks like on default. Here we have a cube as our domain with the default settings, and a curved circle as our curve guide force using the default force settings, and an icosphere as our fluid. As you can see, the force is attracting the fluid, and the force is so strong that the fluid flies past the circle, hits the domain walls, and then rubber bands back to the curve, all while fighting the domain gravity. Now, although the default curve attraction force is equal to the gravity amount of the domain, this max force multiplier value here allows the curve force to grow to a max value, in this case, of 29.4. And that's why the gravity of the domain is not affecting the fluid here. To see a visual guide of what the forces are doing in your scene, you can go to your domain settings and under flipfluid debug, turn on force field debugging. And to see this, you need to refresh the frame. So I usually hit the frame forward or backward. Now let's reduce the max force limit factor to 1, essentially maxing the fluid force to what you set under attraction. With this lower force value, you can see the fluid is caught in a loop of attraction between the gravity and the curve values. So let's remove gravity from our domain and focus on the curve guide force options. I'll also return the max force limit factor to its original amount. Next up is flow. With a value of 1, you can see the fluid is flowing or following the curve. With a positive value, the fluid will be pushed along the curve in the numerical order of its vertices. And in this case, a negative value would just push the fluid in the opposite direction. Next is spin strength. So I used this in the first video of this series, but if you haven't seen that, it creates a vortex force around the curve geometry. And the positive or negative value will change the direction of that vortex. The spin and flow values will both move fluid away or around the curve object. But because we are using the attraction property in conjunction with the spin, the fluid is being restricted to a small orbit around the curve. Now here's an example without that attraction. As a practical commercial example, I have the spiral curve that is attracting fluid from a cube inflow object. The curve is also using low values of flow and spin to wrap the fluid along the direction of the curve. And my scene also includes an outflow object to remove unnecessary fluid and to keep my simulation time lower. And for this I was going for a milky fluid, so I have one key light here at the top, and here is my material setup. I did have trouble removing the saturation from the subsurface scattering, so I handled that in post, but if anyone can offer a solution, please drop a comment below. Next up, point force. This one is relatively straightforward. Using a single point in space, in this case an empty object, your fluid can be attracted or pushed away. Here I've animated a point to move around the domain. With the default settings, the max force is competing with gravity. And let's look at a universal force parameter, fall-off power. This setting determines how the power of a force object changes compared to the distance from that force object. With the default setting of 1, the fall-off has a linear change. So the change in power has a linear or consistent change based on distance. In this case, the shortest distance to the object has a max force of 29.4, utilizing the max force limit factor. Changing the fall-off to 0 creates a constant force, so the power of the point force does not change based on distance, and the max force limit no longer affects the power. Moving the fall-off to 2 has a gravitational fall-off, or an exponential drop-off in power based on distance. And lastly, we're able to move the fall-off to 3, which increases the fall-off exponentially. The practical example I use for this most often is to control the movement of fluid along a surface. As you can see in this case, the point force is beneath the obstacle, but still controls the flow of the fluid. Next up, volume force. In this scene, I have two torus objects, each with identical volume force settings so you can see how this force interacts with fluid. By definition, the volume force will attract or repel fluids from the interior of an object. However, it will not conform the fluid to the object shape, just direct fluid to or from the mesh interior, as you can see here. You should be aware that this is also a more computational force field to use in your scenes. As a practical example, this force could be used for elemental effects like a lava monster or perhaps water bending like an avatar. And finally, we have surface forces. If you haven't seen our video on creating a fluid reveal, we use the surface force object to move fluid along a mesh to create a visual transition. The surface force object moves fluid toward or away from the surface of the mesh. Unlike the volume force, as the name suggests, the fluid is directed by the surface geometry. This force also won't retain the mesh limits of its object. As you can see in this example, I duplicated the force object and created an obstacle to keep the fluid within the geometry. And as we look inside, you can see the fluid isn't filling the object, but rather spreading along the surface using the force. And that's our quick look at the force objects inside the flipfluids add-on.
Thanks for watching, and if you have any comments or questions, please drop them below. And if you did enjoy the video, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. Stay tuned for more Blender videos, and we'll see you next time.